2012 is the 100-year anniversary of the San Diego Free Speech Fight, one of the most important moments in the history of the city of San Diego. During the winter and spring of 1912, members of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, and their allies in labor and the community engaged in a pitched battle against a city ordinance that banned public speaking in the area around 5th and E Streets in downtown San Diego. During the course of this struggle, many were arrested, beaten, and even killed for asserting their rights to public speech and assembly, for the simple right to stand on a soapbox and speak. While repression shut down the soapboxes at 5th and E temporarily, the right to free speech was eventually restored to San Diegans in 1915, when the ban was overturned and legal picketing was established as a basic right.
I'm a stranger here, just floating your town. I'm a stranger here, just floating your town. Just because I'm a stranger, everybody wants to talk around.
We did 10 celebrations yesterday to each other.
The people that clean the toilets of the 1%. They are getting them out of these buildings and deporting them. They are separating from their families and they are making them lose their homes.
I've been assaulted 4 times down here. I got a ticket for honking my horn 5 seconds in solidarity with these brothers with the labor, and that was illegal use of the horn. So our free speech rights are being quashed here.
The fight 100 years ago was very much about that top percent, Spreckles and the people who actually controlled San Diego. Through the police and through the city council were able to really suppress speech, and we're seeing that happen again here. And so, people were complaining about how an encampment looks or how people smell or what kind of things are going on there. It's very similar to what was going on there. There were safety and health hazards. Well, it's the same excuses they used 100 years ago.
Oh, why don't you work like other folks do? How can I get a job when you're holding down 2? Hallelujah, I'm above. Hallelujah, born again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again.
San Diego around the turn of the century was run by real estate developers and boosters, led in large part by John D. Spreckles. And their goal was to develop San Diego primarily as a retirement community for wealthy and well-to-do retirees from the Midwest and the East Coast who would move to San Diego and live on small subdivided irrigated properties, developing the local citrus industry.
San Diego was a small backwater. It was a city that was trying to define itself against the 2 huge cities to the north, Los Angeles and San Francisco. So it really was a backwater of real estate interests and sort of get-rich-quick people coming for their health, people coming for the climate, people coming for a new start. So we have a city here who deliberately constructed itself as a postcard and has jealously guarded that image for almost its entire span.
One way of thinking about the Panama-California Exposition of 1915 is as a kind of coming out party for San Diego. So essentially what you had was a utopian vision for the elites that drew on the kind of California mission fantasy of the past to present a kind of romantic backdrop for the Anglos of the present to come and create a San Diego that fit the boosters' vision.
It had a gorgeous climate. It was next to the ocean. A lot of elites to the north, Hollywood, rich folks, came down to San Diego to partake of its climate and of its pleasures. Fatty Arbuckle and Mabel Normand came down to make a film about the exposition.
San Diego in the turn of the century was something close to a one-man town, even more than Los Angeles. John Spreckels controlled almost every industry and was opposed by a small group of progressives, some of them famous, and by a small branch of the Socialist Party.
He came from a moneyed family that had made their money in San Francisco. They were sugar barons in Hawaii. He had real estate interests, railroad interests. He ran the union and had his hand in much of San Diego's economic and political machinery. The other competing elite during this period was George Marston, perhaps a much more tolerant version of San Diego's elite, a proponent of the city beautiful, someone who supported, the rights of free speech of those people who disagreed with him. And really you look at the two of them as kind of two possible visions of San Diego. Marston's was the version of San Diego that lost that battle. Spreckels was the version of San Diego that won, and a much heavier-handed version of the San Diego elite.
Conditions of labor in San Diego at the turn of the century were divided on ethnic and racial fault lines. Mexican-American labor, in large part with the economic and social dislocations that led to the Mexican Revolution, had already precipitated large immigrant flows across the border, and San Diego developers, especially John D. Spreckels, had primarily utilized Mexican labor to undercut the wages of local white laborers and divide the workforce against itself. Work was very difficult. Most workers were paid barely what we would call a living wage in today's terms to be able to reproduce and support their families. Many workers ended up being unable to marry because they could not support and raise a family.
Whenever I get all the money I earn, the boss will be broke and to work he must turn. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, I'm again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again.
In the American West, in the early 20th century, agriculture still dependent on an enormous army, 100,000 strong, basically single male bachelor workers of various ethnicities. And they harvested everything from oranges in Southern California to wheat on the Great Plains. And then during the winter, they would hole up in the skid rows of western cities. And the Wobblies, of course, all of whom were experts in riding the blinds and rods, hobos, organized in the field and they organized in the hobo camps, but the greatest concentration of migrant workers was in the skid rows during the winter. So it was absolutely essential to the organization of this working class to be able to hold meetings and to be able to stand on a soapbox.
I think one of the things that was really important about the IWW was the fact that they were willing to take in anyone. They were interested in not only people that were American citizens, but people that were, involved in migrant labor.
A significant aspect of the IWW was the recognition of the need to organize workers across borders, across barriers, and ultimately uniting the working class that was itself largely immigrant or the children of immigrants.
Free speech fights involving both the Socialist Party and the IWW began around 1907 in Seattle and a short fight, I believe, in San Francisco, and then to harvest centers like Spokane on the Great Plains, Missoula, Montana, and then eventually came to Fresno when the IWW began to organize workers in the Central Valley. Stockton, there was a big free speech fight. The most famous of all, of course, occurred in San Diego in 1912.
The free speech fight in San Diego, some believe, was precipitated at the agitation of General Harrison Gray Otis, who was the owner of the Los Angeles Times, who came to San Diego for a meeting in November of 1911 to suggest to the city fathers of San Diego that they repress free speech like Los Angeles just had, out of concern that labor agitation would prevent the development of the city along the lines that the city fathers desired. One of the precipitating factors of the San Diego free speech fight was that the IWW had decided to cross the color line and organize Mexican American workers in San Diego. In 1910, they had organized the workers of the San Diego Consolidated Gas and Electric Company, who primarily shoveled coal for the power plants owned by John D. Spreckels. And they had successfully won a strike and a pay raise. And the IWW in late 1911, early 1912 was in the process of organizing also the construction trades and building workers and the local city public works crews, which were also mostly primarily Mexican American workers.
It was here, at the intersection of 5th and E, that was the ground zero of the San Diego free speech fight. And here what the Wobblies did was set up soapboxes on the ground and stand up and give speeches such as, "Fellow workers and friends, how come you've got nothing and Spreckels has everything? It's time to join the one big union and take over the means of production." What happened as a result of this is it outraged the city's father, so Spreckels and his allies in the city council ended up passing an ordinance banning singing and speaking on the streets.
Once the city passed Ordinance 4623, which banned speaking in the congested district of town, which nobody honestly believed was a congested district, the people who felt that their speech was being repressed decided that they were going to nonviolently and passively resist by getting up and speaking anyways and risk arrest to challenge the law. Many who got up maybe made it through reading the beginning of the Declaration of Independence before they were pulled down off the soapbox by the police and arrested. And they were very quickly and immediately charged not with violating the ordinance, but with conspiracy to violate the ordinance, which would be a felony charge.
And then this ban was met with resistance by the IWW. There were hundreds of people arrested, taken off of soapboxes as soon as they said "fellow workers and friends." They filled the jails, and then this was followed by a round of vigilante violence.
The Wobblies were the last people you wanted to put in jail cells. For one thing, they drove the jailers nuts. They were constantly singing and chanting, and they developed a whole repertoire of tactics, things called like building, I think it was called building the battleship in the cell to continue the resistance. And even when they were hosed down or they were taken out and beaten them, this was a component in their victories. They simply morally were stronger. Conditions in the jails were awful, yet the IWW kept coming. That really was the hallmark of the IWW's free speech fight. It was the ability that when repression was the greatest and when the jails were full, still hundreds of people came from all over the country, to go to jail, to be beaten on the head, to risk the vigilantes.
So in San Diego, you had business leaders, known champions of progress and business and all those things, coming out in support of the workers who were being repressed and of their freedom of speech right. That had the effect of lots of other people besides workers buying into the notion that people shouldn't be brutally repressed just for speaking out.
George Marston, a local business leader, had actually advocated for the city to find an alternative location for the protesters to be able to gather together and be able to be heard, as well as not create a traffic jam in that Stingery district if that was the city's problem.
And it's no coincidence that it's his youngest daughter, Helen, who goes on to found the ACLU of San Diego in 1933.
Abram Sauer, who was the editor of the San Diego Herald, had published an editorial that criticized the vigilante violence, and he was kidnapped by a group of vigilantes who took him out into a remote area of town, hung him on a tree with his toes dangling just above the ground, and threatened his life if he spoke about it at all or published his newspaper ever again in San Diego. Another critical figure in the IWW free speech fight was the Reverend George Woodby. George Woodby was born a slave in the 1850s in Tennessee and came to California after a period of political activism for both the Republican and Democratic parties, after which he became disillusioned and became a socialist and a minister in the Black Baptist Church. He came to San Diego in 1902 and was among the most active of the socialist agitators here in San Diego and was a regular figure on Soapbox Row. When the free speech fight began, he was among the first of the arrestees and one of the leaders of the San Diego Free Speech League.
Oh, I went to a bar and I asked for a drink. He gave me a glass and he showed me the thing. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout to revive us again.
I try to teach political science from an activist point of view. I think that this particular event, the free speech fight in San Diego, is an excellent vehicle for explaining ideas of democracy, ideas of radical action, a radical history that often many of our students have never heard of. The free speech fight gives them a local vision, and it's a vehicle for us to make that discussion kind of come to life. They can walk around downtown and see the places where people spoke, like Emma Goldman and others.
It was here in 1912 where Emma Goldman and her lover Ben Reitman came to San Diego on the train to speak. When they got off the train, they were met at the station by a mob of women screaming, "Give us the anarchist murderess, we'll tear out her guts." The crowd was so seemingly dangerous that Goldman and Reitman had to be escorted up Broadway to the U.S. Grant Hotel.
This image is really striking because here we have a woman anarchist coming to support the free speech fight, being met by other women on the other side of a class divide, I suppose. Goldman was coming to speak to and for working class voices. And it seems to me that the women who met her at the station, that they would go out of their way to meet her at the station, were there to protect their own interests. That a more egalitarian society would cut into their privilege as of what kept women or whatever it is that they were.
Once at the hotel, Goldman negotiated with Mayor Wadham and Police Chief Wilson for the right to speak from a second-story window to the mob assembled across the street in the park. During this negotiation, Reitman was kidnapped by vigilantes, taken north to a place near Penasquitos, forced to run the gauntlet, tortured horribly. He had IWW burned into his buttocks with a cigar.
They tried to tar and feather him, and they also tried to sodomize him. What's interesting to me about this is that rather than taking Goldman north and tarring and feathering and raping her, they instead took her partner, her companion, her male companion. I'm not sure exactly what to make of this, but it was a way. It ended up terrorizing Reitman, so that when they came back in 1913 and still weren't allowed to speak, when she came back in 1915, he was unable to set foot in San Diego again.
The incredible violence and terrorism of the free speech fight on the part of the vigilantes and the powers that be in San Diego during this period is interesting, because you could have argued that they could have just said, go ahead and speak on the soapbox. There's not many IWW members in San Diego. We'll just ignore you and eventually you'll go away. So really what was going on here was there was no real legitimate threat of a revolution happening in San Diego in 1912. So the violence was really more about a deep-seated anxiety on the part of the elites and those who were perhaps aligned with the elites, wanted to be part of that they didn't want San Diego to be the kind of city that had a militant, radical, well-organized working class.
I think there's two reasons why there was so much brutality in the San Diego free speech fight. One has to do with the politics of the progressive era. While the progressive era sought in many ways to change the morality of politics in the United States, it sought to change the morality of politics in a way that did not change the established political economic order. And there was a lot of anxiety due to the changing relationship of both gender and ethnic relations. Women had just obtained the vote in California at this time, and San Diego was also experiencing the beginning of large-scale Mexican migration in the aftermath of the outset of the Mexican Revolution, which upset the notion that many white conservative San Diegans from the Midwest and the East held of a utopia on the ocean.
I teach women's issues in the American political process at San Diego State, and not many of our students there are aware of, the impact that women, although they were a minority and those that were participating in the free speech fight here in San Diego, the impact that they had in really challenging social and gender norms, in speaking out and putting themselves on the line, and contradicting much of the kind of rhetoric of the day about women not participating or not believing in this fight.
I think the second critical reason why there was so much brutality during the San Diego free speech fight was because the IWW, in their stated politics and in their actual practice, crossed the color line and purposefully tried to destroy the Jim Crow system of labor that was being developed in the Southern California at that time, which, unlike the Southeast and the Southwest, was developed on Mexican labor as an underclass.
The extremity of the violence has always puzzled me in the vigilantes' response to the free speech fight and to the Wobblies, to the activists who they pulled off the streets and terrorized. It's so over the top. It's so incredible that people would be kidnapped, driven north, and so horribly maimed and abused and subjected to often sexual torture, as well as being beaten and left for dead. Just the very thought of there being a kind of parity between classes, between races, between men and women, sent these men into such an almost sexual panic. Actually, it wasn't almost a sexual panic. In many cases, it had to have been a full-blown one for some of the things that they did to people's bodies.
It's important to emphasize that the IWW is probably the most nonviolent labor organization in American history. American workers have a long and noble tradition of fighting back with arms if need be, but the IWW very early on recognized that when you're organizing the most powerless workers, migrant workers, homeless workers, nonviolence, not as a moral principle, but as a strategy, was the most effective. And though they were calumniated and associated with violence, in fact, the IWW pioneered so much of the passive resistance later used by the anti-war movement and by the civil rights movement.
There is power in a band of working folk when we stand hand in hand. That's the power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand.
While repression shut down the soapboxes at Fifth and E temporarily, the right to free speech was eventually restored to San Diegans in 1915, when the ban was overturned and legal picketing was established as a basic right. Today, anyone who enjoys the right to assemble, protest, and speak in public in San Diego has the Free Speech League of the Progressive Era to thank for fighting to maintain the basic rights of all San Diegans.
And in fact, nationally, the San Diego free speech fights are the beginning of the historical record of the ACLU, or at least it's the case that the earliest documents in the National Archives of the ACLU is 400 pages about the San Diego free speech fights.
Well, it's funny because when we started to plan for our 100th celebration of the IWW fights, Occupy wasn't yet happening. And so we were talking about free speech in almost a situation that was one which we had won. And so we were going to celebrate. We were going to ask the city council to apologize for the very oppressive laws that they had passed here in San Diego and really celebrate the fighting of those laws and labor's role in that battle. And it's funny, over the last few months, of course, a new battle has emerged, and a new battle over the right to assemble and the right to speak. And so it's timely, of course, to once again take on the structure of San Diego.
We will not let
most important things about the Occupy movement has been bringing about a language that most Americans had prior to this not understood. Really discussions of rich and poor, the idea of disparity of wealth, seeing real true inequality and understanding ways of actually discussing it, even in the mainstream, to a degree that hasn't been occurring prior to that.
So that's why the Labor Council is involved with this. As far as Occupy, we thought it was great and endorsed it immediately because we've been talking about income inequality for well over the last few years, and to get the kind of attention that Occupy has by talking about who really caused this economic crisis, you know, it being the banks and Wall Street, and not our third grade teachers, not our college professors, not our trash truck drivers. We think that's important, and it's an important thing to continue to highlight.
You know, throughout history, the IWW was huge down here, and working with the Wobblies across the border over in Mexico. This is at the turn of the century. People died down here. That was a 3-year struggle just to get some of the illegal municipal codes they had against workers' rights and people being able to live free and secured and having First Amendment rights here. It took them 3 years to get through, but ultimately they did. They were victorious. We're sure this movement is going forward as well. 1% is mighty powerful. It's not going to be an easy struggle, but we're here for the distance, and we're growing. Every time they crush us, we come out like this the day after.
It's encouraging now, the broad spectrum, political spectrum of people who look back on the free speech fights and thank labor for bringing about greater free speech, who recognize that what happened was wrong. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives all recognize the value of free speech, and that's worth celebrating.
I'm a stranger here, just floating your town. I'm a stranger here, just floating your town. Just because I'm a stranger, everybody wants to talk me around. Well, I wonder why some people treat the strangers so